Text for this evening comes to us from Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. One time Jesus entered a house and the crowd began to gather again. Soon he and his disciples couldn't even find time to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away. He's out of their mind, they said. But the teachers of the religious law who had arrived from Jerusalem said, "He's possessed by Satan, the prince of demons. That's where he gets the power to cast out demons." And Jesus called them over to respond with an illustration. "How can Satan cast out Satan?" he asked. "A kingdom divided by civil war will collapse. Similarly, a family splintered by feuding will fall apart. And if Satan is divided against himself, how can he stand? He would never survive. Let me illustrate this further. Who is powerful enough to enter the house of a strong man and plunder his goods? Only someone who is even stronger is the one who could tie him up and then plunder the house. I tell you the truth. All sin and blasphemy can be forgiven, but anyone who blasphemes the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. This is a sin with eternal consequences." He told them this because they were saying he was possessed by an evil spirit. And then Jesus' mother and brothers came out to see him. They stood outside and they sent word for him to come out and talk to them. There was a crowd sitting by Jesus, and someone said, "Your mother and your brothers are here. They are asking for you." And Jesus replied, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" And then he looked at those around him and he said, "Look, these are my mother and my brothers and my sister. Anyone who does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother." Jesus had gone outside of the bounds of the religion that he had grown up in, outside of his home, and his family was worried about him. Perhaps he was confused, maybe he needed some correction, maybe he had a mental breakdown. And it wasn't just Jesus' family who was concerned about him either. Some of the teachers of the law traveled up from Jerusalem, which is 80 miles away, just to pass judgment on Jesus' teaching for his growing movement. And I don't know about you, but this actually feels really familiar to me. Families showing up to try and collect you from the faith where loving others has maybe gone too far. Super religious persons showing up to pass judgment or discredit you for doing God's work by saying what you are doing is evil and not God's will at all. This scene has played out in personal lives and in faith movements throughout time. Because anytime an individual does something that's outside of the bounds of what is the current traditional church or faith, the response is the same. Your family shows up and tries to collect you. And they ask you if you're sure you're not going down the wrong path. Have you read this article? Did you listen to this podcast? Or this sermon that disagrees with your life or your faith or your ministry? Have you done that? And if you won't fall in line and move back inside the bounds of your family of origin's belief or faith, you often lose your family, and you're forced to build a family of choice instead. And religious leaders, they are forever pointing out other people whose faith is different than their own and proclaiming that their beliefs are from the devil. It's really an old script. It happens time after time after time. And in some senses, we too feel like we live in these polarizing times, don't we? It often seems like we can't disagree with anyone without having to demonize them or being demonized by them. Years ago, while I was serving a church here in Lawrence, Westboro Baptist showed up to picket us. Maybe you've heard of them. This Topeka, Kansas church is known for engaging inflammatory, homophobic, anti-American pickets, as well as their hate speech against Jews, Muslims, transgender individuals, and numerous Christian denominations. In fact, I'm pretty sure they just basically disapprove of every church but their own. And back then, a few days before Westboro would show up to picket, they would actually release this press release blurb that would explain why that school or that funeral or that church or that community was being picketed. I haven't looked to see if they still do this anymore. But if you don't take these blurbs too seriously, and they would not be triggering for you, they can be really entertaining to read. The first time our church was picketed, they said we were being picketed because our church had a female minister, me, and the cross in our sanctuary was too large, and therefore it was an idol. But my husband, Britt, and I, we were feeling pretty good about their assessment because at least we weren't a dog kennel masquerading as a church, because that was the language that they had used for multiple other communities that they were picketing on the same day. And the Westboro folks, they kind of remind me of the teachers of the law in this text. They consider themselves to be deeply devoted and religious people. They consider their beliefs to be the right ones. And so like the teachers of the law in our text today, they do think it's their job to show up to these schools, churches, funerals, and gatherings just so they can let everyone know that they are wrong and that what they are being taught is going to send people to hell. Or just that they're evil. Now, Jesus chooses to engage with the teachers of the law in our text this morning, they claim that he had made a deal with the devil, and he points out how ridiculous the whole concept of that would be. Isn't making a deal with the embodiment of evil to drive out evil kind of counterproductive? A house or a kingdom or a family divided against itself can't stand. And as soon as he finishes with the teachers of the law, Jesus is told that his mother and his siblings have shown up. They are outside. They are looking for him. But instead of rushing to see them, instead of calming their fears about his mental state, he looks around the room at the crowd of people around him, and he says, "These are my mother and my brothers and my sisters. These are my family." And I don't think Jesus' statement here was meant to be a slight to his family. Later on in the biblical text, we see him making sure his mother is taken care of upon his death. But in this moment, Jesus uses this opportunity to redraw the boundaries of what constitutes a family. Anyone who does the will of God is my mother, my brother, my sister, my family. And I love the idea of Jesus looking around him at this crowd of misfits, of people in need of hope and healing, of individuals of all shapes and sizes, education and background, saying, "This is my family." Because there's something beautiful about the people who choose to be in our lives, isn't there? But then I'm also struck by this contrasting and crazy reality that there are a lot of people in our world today who believe that they're doing the will of God, with whom I deeply disagree with, and with whom deeply disagree with me. I mean, even in our story, Jesus obviously thought he was doing the will of God, but so did the teachers of the law who showed up to oppose him. And this all brings me back in my mind to the earlier statement to the teachers of the law. How does a house or a kingdom or a family divided against itself stand? If God's house is divided against itself, can it stand? And I have to ask myself, am I willing to claim those individuals as my siblings of faith? We live in polarizing times. I catch myself talking about them, musing over the perceived craziness I see in other people's actions or beliefs or ideas. And sometimes, just like in our story today, I kind of hope that somebody's well-meaning parents, guardians, siblings would come and collect my crazy religious relatives and siblings in order to limit the damage that they are causing to the world, to their relationship with others, on their social media platforms, in politics, and to the wider witness of who God is in our world. But guess what? If we are a person of faith, and based on Jesus' statement these individuals are also our family too. All these people who we might have deep disagreements with are also created in the image of God, loved by God, and attempting to do God's will. So how do we move forward? When we feel like others in our wider faith community or the wider world stage are teaching terrible things. For example, how can we proclaim our disagreement with much of the Westboro Baptist Church's beliefs and yet remember that each individual in that community is someone made in the image of God and loved by God? Many of the grandchildren of the founder of Westboro Baptist Church have left the church. And when they did that, they were also forced to become estranged from their family members, because the price of leaving that faith community is the price of losing your family. And as I followed the stories of these grandchildren, I have always been interested in what it was that caused such a powerful shift in their beliefs. A shift that was so powerful that they were willing to become estranged from their family in order to believe it. And you know what it wasn't that changed their minds? It wasn't counter-protesters. It wasn't shouting matches. It was the kind people who disagreed with them and their beliefs, and yet who treated them with love and respect and dignity, which is something that their community would never provide to an outsider that they disagreed with. Friends, demonizing someone will never provide an opening for people to change. Jesus' life led him to the cross, and even as he was dying, he asked God to forgive the people who crucified him. Jesus knew that love was the only thing strong enough to disarm the hate and the evil that is done in our world. And I think that's still true today. Megan Phelps Roper, one of the grandchildren who left Westboro Baptist Church, has apologized to as many of the individuals her family has harmed as she has been able to. And yet, you know what else is true? Megan has never stopped loving her family. In fact, even though she has left the Christian faith, she says she still searches the scriptures to try and find a way to reach her family with a message of love. She has learned how to separate bad theology from their belovedness. And I hope that it's something that we can get better at too, because a divided house, it can't stand. We live in polarizing times. So how can we speak the truth, just like Jesus did, and yet see the belovedness of every person that we come into contact with?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Britt Detain, and my pronouns are he, him. A few months ago, I attended a friend's wedding. I arrived a few minutes early and happened to sit next to someone that I used to go to church with, but hadn't seen for some time. We exchanged pleasantries and talked about what had been taking place in our lives since we had last spoken. And while updating me on their status, they mentioned that their old church, which they still were a member of, had recently separated from the denomination it had been part of since its inception over a century ago, and was now operating independently. They went on to say that the reason behind the split was that the church leaders disagreed with the former denomination's stance on being open and affirming to LGBTQ individuals, and felt compelled to break away to operate the church in a way more aligned with their conservative beliefs. It was so disappointing to hear this person talk about this transition so enthusiastically. Disappointing because I have a lot of great memories from my time attending this church, some of which involve being open to people from all walks of life. That was no longer the case. Disappointing also that my friends and others who happen to be in the LGBTQ community don't have a space where they are welcome. But more than anything, disappointing because this person, if you knew them, you would say they are one of the kindest, sweetest, most dependable people you will ever meet. They volunteered their time at the church helping out with projects around, helping out church ministries. They would attend events that would support ministries and events that were going on there. And no matter what was happening in their life, they would always greet you with a smile and a warm handshake. And they'd be willing to help you out if you ever needed it. In fact, on a couple of occasions, they even came over to our house on a weekend, on their own time, didn't ask for money or anything else, and they would help us out with a couple of the minor house projects that were well above our expertise on home improvement projects. But isn't this kind of a perfect picture of what faith looks like in society today? You have people that can live in harmony, and you can be working with them, you can be friends with them, you can be family, and they are just the wonderful, great people. You enjoy being around them. They're wonderful people, and yet you see them making these statements, doing things, saying things that you just really have a hard time reconciling with. And as Tiffany talked about tonight, it's one of those things where I know one part of me says, I know that they're living the way that they think they should be. But on the other hand, I look at this and say, I don't remember the part in the Bible where Jesus started making disparaging comments about these people. No, he welcomed them to their table. And so my hope is that as we go forward and we look at the people that are out there that may not agree with us, we are willing to show graciousness and love to them, even if they don't have as welcoming of a stance as we do.